As I look back on the events of that summer, I realize just how deeply everything changed. Gatsby's dream, his pursuit of something that was always out of reach, had consumed him. But what had he really gained? What had any of us gained from this chase for wealth, status, and success? In the days following his death, I couldn't help but reflect on what had gone wrong, on how all the dreams we chase ultimately leave us empty. And so, as I tried to piece together the life of the man who had been both larger than life and tragically flawed, I realized that Gatsby's story is a reflection of a deeper truth. A truth about the American dream and the fragile hopes that define us all. But it's not just Gatsby's dream that's left behind. It's the dream of a world that, in the end, cannot give us what we long for. After Gatsby's death, it was impossible to ignore the emptiness that surrounded him. His mansion, once a beacon of excess and grandeur, stood silent. The people who had once crowded his house, laughing and drinking, came and went, but no one stayed long enough to care about him when it mattered. In the end, no one came to his funeral. Not a single person who had once celebrated at his parties came to pay their respects. The world he had tried so hard to be a part of, the world that had looked at him with admiration, had moved on without a second thought. Gatsby had built his life around the idea of an ideal, of an American dream that was meant to bring him happiness, success, and love. But in the end, his dream was hollow. He had tried to recreate the past, to turn back time and win back Daisy, but in doing so, he had forgotten that the past could never be recaptured. Daisy, like the world around him, had changed. She was no longer the woman Gatsby remembered, and no matter how much wealth or power he amassed, he could never make her his again. In the days following Gatsby's death, I was forced to confront the truth about the American dream itself. The dream that Gatsby had chased, the dream of wealth and success, was not the dream that the world promised. It was a fantasy, an illusion. Gatsby had been right about one thing. He had reached for something beyond himself, but it was always out of reach. And in the end, the dream destroyed him. The funeral was a stark contrast to the grand parties Gatsby had once hosted. No one cared enough to come. The guests who had once filled his halls with laughter had vanished as quickly as they had come. Gatsby had spent so much of his life trying to impress people who never truly saw him. They were drawn to his wealth, his power, but they were never interested in the man behind the facade. They had used him, and when the dream was over, they were gone. As I stood there at Gatsby's funeral, I realized the truth of the world he had tried to break into. It was a world built on illusion, on false promises, and on the belief that wealth and status could give us everything we wanted. But in the end, those things didn't matter. They were nothing more than empty vessels, filled with the hopes of people who couldn't understand that happiness and success didn't come from money or power. They came from something more elusive, more fragile, something that no one could touch, no matter how hard they tried. I couldn't help but think about my own life, about the world I had left behind in the Midwest. I had come to New York looking for something, but I hadn't known what. I had been swept up in the glamour of it all, in the world of wealth and success that Gatsby had tried so hard to be a part of. But now, after everything that had happened, I realized that it was all just a facade. There was nothing real about it, and so I decided it was time to leave. The city that had once seemed so full of promise had turned out to be empty, hollow. I was disillusioned by the emptiness of it all, by the way people lived their lives for the illusion of success, for the dream of something they could never have. The city was full of people who were chasing something they would never reach, just as Gatsby had, and in the end, none of it mattered. I returned to the Midwest, back to a quieter, simpler life. But even as I left New York, I couldn't forget what I had learned. The American dream, the dream of wealth, of success, of happiness, it was all an illusion. It was a dream that could never be fully realized, no matter how hard we tried. It was a dream that, like Gatsby's, would always remain out of reach. As I looked back on the summer, I realized how much of it had been about chasing dreams, about living in illusions. But in the end, the truth was clear. Those dreams could never be realized, and the world we lived in was one of false promises, empty promises. And it was only when we stopped chasing them that we could see the truth, that we were all just like Gatsby, reaching for something that was always